A key moment is playing out right now in Eastern Europe with implications for geopolitics for years to come. Russia is making a brazen challenge to the established international order, and this morning the United States and other countries have responded with sanctions. Will they be enough to deter Vladimir Putin from going further than he already has? With the recognition of those breakaway regions of Ukraine and saying troops will be sent into Luhansk and Donetsk. We've got ABC correspondent Tom Joyner in Lviv in Ukraine, North America correspondent Carrington Clarke in Washington, and political reporter Borys in Canberra. Tom, to you first. So have fresh Russian troops actually crossed the border from Russia into Ukraine yet?
Well, Joe, in short, yes, but it's really difficult to get a clear idea of what exactly Russian troops are doing at the moment in Ukraine. We know that the European Union's foreign policy chief has said that there are troops in the eastern part of the country in areas controlled by Russian-backed separatists, but the Kremlin is yet to confirm this. But either way, it could be the beginning of something much bigger. It isn't looking like a full-scale invasion by Russian forces in Ukraine yet, but certainly NATO is concerned that this could escalate further. Certainly the Russian government, Russia isn't showing any signs of backing down. In fact, quite the opposite. Its leader, Vladimir Putin, has only escalated and ramped up his rhetoric over the last couple of days. World leaders are, of course, still trying to urge this situation be resolved by diplomatic means rather than armed conflict. Today, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held crisis talks and affirmed that desire, his desire, to see this resolved by diplomatic talks.
And so, Tom, you're in the city of Lviv in Ukraine. How far is that from the Russian border, and what's the mood like where you are?
Well, as you say, Joe, Lviv is about 1,000 or so kilometres west of the Russian border. It's in the western part of Ukraine. We're probably closer to Poland than anything else. Lviv has been, over the last few days and weeks, a bit of a sanctuary, I guess, a bit of a safe haven, not just for Ukrainians who are fleeing from other parts of the country, including the capital, Kiev, to come here seeking safety as close as they can get to Poland, to a NATO-backed country, to the European Union, but also others like diplomats. We know the Australian diplomats in Ukraine decamped from Kiev to Lviv a couple of weeks ago. They've since moved on even further west into Poland. But Lviv is relatively far from the action of what's happening right now in the eastern part of Ukraine in those separatist-controlled areas, Donetsk and Luhansk. But the mood here is quite jubilant. Earlier this evening, we were just walking around. There were groups of people out on the streets. There were restaurants and bars, people spilling out, drinking hot vodka, enjoying cups of hot chocolate. There was an ice rink in the main square there. Most people that you ask here in Lviv what they think of the situation, many of them will tell you that there's nothing to worry about, that there's no point creating a fuss or raising panic over something that hasn't happened yet, even though all signs point to something imminent happening. But certainly many here in Lviv, Ukrainians and diplomats alike, will be hoping that what does occur in the east doesn't spread too much closer to where they are here.
OK, let's now go to Carrington Clarke in the US. Carrington, we had this key response from President Joe Biden in the last few hours outlining sanctions. Just take us through exactly what's been announced.
Good morning to you, Joe. Well, the most significant part of this speech perhaps was the President of the United States, Joe Biden, calling this the start of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. He has outlined three key sanctions that he say go much further than the sanctions that were imposed on Russia back in 2014 when they invaded Crimea, which was then a whole part of Ukraine and is now controlled by Russia. This time they've got a full blocking sanctions on two significant Russian financial institutions, two large banks that are particularly linked with the military in Russia. They've also moved to lock out Russia from accessing money markets in the West. And this is done in cohort with the European sanctions that we've also seen announced. And this is to block those in the West from helping to fund significant Russian institutions like their Reserve Bank and the Russian state. So blocking them from actually accessing that money in secondary markets. And then we also have directives to sanction individuals. And these are people who the US says are directly linked to the regime in Russia. And this, they say, is a warning to those others who are closely affiliated with President Putin, that they will be coming after them next. So this is a significant move, but the US president was clear that this is just the first tranche of sanctions, and that if Russia goes further, then as they have done so far in just declaring their support for the independence of these two breakaway regions of Ukraine, then there are further tranches of sanctions to come.
This is the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, as he indicated and asked permission to be able to do from his Duma. I'm going to begin to impose sanctions in response far beyond the steps we and our allies and partners implemented in 2014. And if Russia goes further with this invasion, we stand prepared to go further as with sanctions.
And Carrington, the US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has spoken just in the last hour. What's he had to say?
Yeah, so Secretary of State Blinken was meeting with his Ukrainian counterpart, and this is the about fourth meeting they said that they've had just in recent days, meeting here in the US. Probably the most significant thing that we've heard announced from Secretary Blinken is that he thinks he's no longer going to allow, as he calls it, the cover of the pretense of diplomacy to be utilised by Russia. And now that they have moved to this next stage, and as I said, the President of the United States calling it the start of the invasion of Ukraine, that it was no longer in the US's interests for Secretary Blinken to meet with his Russian counterpart.
I agreed to meet Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov this week on February 24th to discuss our country's respective concerns about European security, but only if Russia did not invade Ukraine. Now that we see the invasion is beginning and Russia has made clear its wholesale rejection of diplomacy, it does not make sense to go forward with that meeting at this time.
US Secretary of State speaking there. And Carrington, what sanctions have European leaders announced?
Well, we have heard both from the European Union and they, like the US, are putting in place particular economic and financial sanctions in regards to the access that Russia has to Western money markets. The United Kingdom has also slapped sanctions on individual members of the Russian parliament. Perhaps, though, the most significant sanction or action we've seen taken, both either by the United States or by the Europeans, is from Germany. And they have agreed to block effectively the initiation of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline from Russia. Now, this has been a contentious point between Germany in particular and the United States for quite a long time. The United States, even under Donald Trump, said that this was giving significant power to Russia, connecting them so directly to Europe and allowing them to continue to export large amounts of energy to the continent, and gave them too much leverage. So it's a significant move from Germany to now block this, and many analysts are saying this would be unexpected from Vladimir Putin and perhaps the most significant sanction that we've seen slapped on them since this invasion of Ukraine.
OK, now to Steph Ferrier in Canberra. Steph, what's Australia doing on the sanctions front?
Good morning, Joe. Well, it was just yesterday that the Prime Minister said Australia would move just as quickly on sanctions as soon as other countries did so. However, we haven't heard from Scott Morrison this morning just yet. We do know that he's conveyed a National Security Committee meeting. That's key cabinet ministers are meeting to finalise Australia's response to Russia's growing aggression against Ukraine. Now, we need to take a step back to 2014 to look at what Australia did then against Russia following the downing of MH17, because we put sanctions in place in 2014. It means that Australia is now actually limited in what it can do in terms of introducing new sanctions. Back then, Australia put travel bans in place and also suspended certain finance and economic trade deals that were in place at the time. So while what Australia will announce will be limited, the point behind doing so is to ensure that, number one, Australia is in lockstep with other countries, also to ensure that that we're sending a strong message to Russia that we don't agree with what they're doing, and to ensure that there isn't a safe haven here for Russians to stash their money or to operate here, because the sanctions that have been imposed in the US and the UK, that will affect a number of Russians where, you know, historically a lot of the money has been kept, not here in Australia, but introducing these measures will ensure it's the same across the board. Now, while we're yet to have explained exactly what Australia will do, the Foreign Minister Marise Payne was on RM Breakfast this morning, and she was asked whether Australia will consider kicking out diplomats, Russian diplomats, that are based here in Canberra.
Dealing with diplomats in that way, whether it is expulsions or recalls, is always an option. Our focus at the moment, though, is on targeted sanctions that will have an impact on those responsible. Whilst there are other options and other tools, if you like, in the toolkit, such as how we deal with diplomats, that's a matter I'll turn my mind to at an appropriate time.
And Steph, how many Australians are still in Ukraine?
At the moment, there's just over 100, Joe, that have registered with the Department of Foreign Affairs. Australia has been urging Australians to leave Ukraine. DFAT issued that advice the other week, and the Foreign Minister Marise Payne once again urging Australians to leave as soon as they can. The federal government is so concerned about the situation there that they have ensured all their diplomats have now left the country. And on top of that, additional diplomats and officials are now based in Poland and Romania to help with Australians still on the ground in Ukraine.
We'll leave it there. Tom Joyner in Lviv in Ukraine, Carrington Clarke in Washington in the US, and Steph Borys there in Canberra. And in the last few moments, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been speaking in New York, saying he's concerned about the situation in Ukraine. Let's take a listen.
Our world is facing the biggest global peace and security crisis in recent years, certainly in my tenure as Secretary General. We face a moment that I sincerely hope would not come. I'm deeply troubled by the latest developments regarding Ukraine, including reports of increased ceasefire violations across the contact line and the real risk of further escalation on the ground. And I am especially concerned for the safety and well-being of all those who have already suffered from so much death, destruction and displacement. Let me be clear. The decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the so-called independence of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions is a violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. Such a unilateral measure conflicts directly with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and is inconsistent with the so-called Friendly Relations Declaration of the General Assembly, which the International Court of Justice has repeatedly cited as representing international law. It is also a death blow to the Minsk agreements endorsed by the Security Council. The principles of the UN Charter are not an à la carte menu. They cannot be applied selectively. Member States have accepted them all, and they must apply them all. I'm also concerned about the perversion of the concept of peacekeeping. I'm proud of the achievements of UN peacekeeping operations in which so many blue helmets have sacrificed their lives to protect civilians. When troops of one country enter the territory of another country without its consent, they are not impartial peacekeepers. They are not peacekeepers at all. The United Nations, in line with the relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, stands fully behind the sovereignty, political independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. We are continuing to support the people of Ukraine through our humanitarian operations and human rights efforts. At this critical moment, I call for an immediate ceasefire and re-establishment of the rule of law. We need restraint and reason. We need de-escalation now. I urge all to refrain from actions and statements that would take this dangerous situation over the brink. It is high time to return to the path of dialogue and negotiations. We must rally and meet this challenge together for peace and to save the people of Ukraine and beyond from the scourge of war. I am fully committed to all efforts to resolve this crisis without further bloodshed. I repeat what I've said several times. My good offices are available, and we will not relent in the search for a peaceful solution. The United Nations, the entire international system are being tested, and we must pass this test. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. The Russian Parliament today authorized action outside the country by the military. It doesn't seem like anything that anybody says or any diplomatic efforts are going to avoid any escalation and future invasions in Ukraine. You've appealed before, so have a lot of other people. What else can be done to really stop this new bloodshed in Europe?
Well, as I said, this is high time for de-escalation. This is high time to return to dialogue and negotiation. I think the present crisis will be, in the end, terribly detrimental both to the Ukraine and to the Russian Federation.
Thank you. McCarthy, we have Steve, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. Russian President stated that the actions that Kiev is conducting against Donetsk and Lugansk are literally genocide. Do you share this assessment? And the second question, please. Some former Ukrainian officials were mentioning the possibility of UN peacekeeping mission deploying to the area. What do you make of that? Thank you.
Well, genocide is a crime that is clearly defined and whose application must be done in line with international law. I do not think it is the case. The second question was?
Peacekeepers in Ukraine.
Yes, it is true. There was a moment in which Ukraine has asked for a UN peacekeeping force in the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. At the time, the Russian Federation accepted the idea of a peacekeeping force, but limited to the protection of OSCE monitors. And there was no agreement in the Security Council trying to make the two positions coincide, and for that reason it was never possible to approve in the Security Council a peacekeeping mission.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All the best.